In this presentation, we will look at weather modification research, Wilhelm Reich and Orgone Energy, Cloudbusters, the HAARP project and its possible purpose, chemtrail evidence hidden in plain view, the evidence for weather modification in action, and legislation which explicitly mentions weather modification and or chemtrails. So really we have to start off by asking the question, can anybody modify the weather? It's a very difficult question to deal with because we always assume that the answer must be no. But as we'll see, this is not true. To go back in history, we've perhaps all heard of rain dances, and these can be found in many cultures, from ancient Egypt to certain Native American tribes. They could still be found in the 20th century Balkans in a ritual known as Paparuda, which is Romanian, or Purpuruna, which is Slavic. And there's a little bit more information on the next slide. The traditional Native American Cherokee tribe performed rain dances to both induce precipitation from the clouds as well as cleanse evil spirits. So there's this intermingling of the spiritual element and the actual weather as well. Cherokee legend says that the summoned rain contains the spirits of dead chiefs who, upon awakening from the clouds, battle evil spirits in the transitional plane between our reality and the spirit world. And this sounds obviously like quite a bit of hokum, but when you start to look into the consciousness aspects of things, which you'll find in many other types of videos, you begin to see that this isn't such a far-fetched idea, in my view. But we won't really explore that in this presentation. We're going to try and stick to the more scientific and physical evidence and anecdotal evidence that is available. It was also believed that particularly elaborate and ornamental rain dances could inspire the participants as well as the audience to partake in unusual acts of spiritual worship. Now, just a quick look at Paparuda, which is the Romanian rain dance. We have here a graphic from September the 9th, 1905, drawn by F. de Heinen from a sketch by Ruck Carnegie. And Paparuda is a Romanian ritual, probably of pagan origin, performed in the spring in times of severe drought. Now again, the pagan beliefs are more earth-centric in that they consider man's relationship with the earth and how we are interlinked. And of course, you know, these have taken a bit of a resurgence, but have kind of morphed into the environmental movement somewhat. So there's a whole range of beliefs now. In the picture, a girl wearing a skirt made of fresh green knitted vines and small branches sings and dances through the streets of the village, stopping at every house where the hosts pour water on her. She is accompanied by the people of the village who dance and shout with the music. The custom has attributed a specific type of dance and a specific melody, and that information comes from Wikipedia. But we'll quickly move on now to the later stuff which is more science-based. And I think most people have heard of cloud seeding, where crystals are introduced into the clouds which are meant to effectively speed up the precipitation of rain which is already there. One scientist associated with the invention of the cloud seeding is Irving Langmuir. He's also done some research into ball lightning as well, and he has this thing called a ball lightning tube. The first attempt at cloud seeding was in Massachusetts in 1946, and a plane seeded a cloud with crushed dry ice, that's carbon dioxide, frozen carbon dioxide, and snow began falling out of that cloud. Noted atmospheric scientist Bernard Vonnegut is credited with discovering the potential of silver iodide for use in cloud seeding. This property is related to a good match in the lattice constant between the two types of crystal. In other words, the size of the water molecule fits nicely with the size of the silver iodide crystal lattice structure, and there's some kind of interplay of those two molecules there. It is important to mention that silver iodide is mostly used for hail suppression, while a new technique called hygroscopic seeding is used for the enhancement of rainfall in warm clouds. So both of them don't actually change the level of moisture that's there, they just change whether it stays in the air or falls to the ground. The pictures on the right here, we have Irving Langmuir at the top, chemist and physicist, and Bernard Vonnegut at the bottom. Now, further to these developments, one private organisation offered during the 1970s to conduct weather modification, which was cloud seeding from the ground using silver iodide flares, and that was Irving P. Crick and Associates of Palm Springs, California. So again, they were using silver iodide crystals. They were contracted by the Oklahoma State University in 1972 to conduct such a seeding project to increase warm cloud rainfall in the Lake Carl Blackwell watershed. The primary water supply was Stillwater, Oklahoma, and this was dangerously low, so this is why they wanted to try and induce some rainfall. The project did not operate for a long enough time to show statistically any change from the natural variations. However, at the same time, seeding operations have been going on in California since 1948, and again it's mainly for hail suppression, particularly these days to stop damage to property with large hailstones. They try and induce falls before that actually happens. But now, on a separate subject, we have Project Storm Fury, but this was again cloud seeding, but this was a more secret project. Project Storm Fury was an ambitious experimental program of research on hurricane modification carried out between 1962 and 1983. The proposed modification technique involved artificial stimulation of the convection outside the eye wall through seeding with silver iodide. The invigorated convection, it was argued, would compete with the original eye wall and lead to reformation of the eye wall at a larger radius, and thus, through partial conservation of angular momentum, produce a decrease in the strongest winds, and this is what this diagram is trying to show. In other words, here we have the original eye wall of the hurricane, and the seeding is introduced in this area, and the old eye wall weakens as a new one grows, which is further out from the eye, and then the new eye wall becomes dominant, and so the wind speed is actually less because the wind is travelling over a wider circumference. Now, with Project Storm Fury, we actually have a surviving witness who gave testimony to this project and his involvement with it. Ben Livingston worked on the project and maintains that their efforts were successful and that hurricanes should be seeded to reduce damage. And here he describes his participation in the project. And this information comes from Alex Jones's InfoWars site.
My name is Ben Livingston. I'm the first person in the world to be given credit for using or making weather control a military weapon system. Oh, I was cleared top secret. As high as you could get. I got interested in weather modification when I was a farm boy. I never could understand why the clouds wasn't bigger, had a little more shade, and was chopping that cotton. So I got in the Navy. I managed to get into meteorology school, and I think that's really where I learned the most of my physics. They sent me to the Hurricane Hunter Squadron in Jacksonville, Florida. We were the first ones to fly into hurricanes for the purpose of modifying them, if you will. That was Project Storm Fury. I began to be extremely confident that we could could do about what we wanted to with a hurricane. The Project Storm Fury had been going on since 1961, and they had already done, or had done 2 experiments, one in 61 and 63. Well, by 1964, when I was there in 1964, I wrote the plan and started to have a track and a mission for every flight that was on the hurricane cloud seeding experiments. On August 18th in 1969, Hurricane Debbie was seeded 5 times at 2-hour intervals, and the maximum wind speeds had decreased from 115 to 80 miles per hour. That's a pretty remarkable reduction of more than 45% in damage reduction potential. The storm was left alone on the 19th, and on the 20th went back and seeded that cloud the second time and decreased the winds again to just under 100 miles per hour, or about 24% more damage reduction potential. It's interesting that we were able to do that and can have the results confirmed by Stanford University in 1969. Some wanted to continue hurricane reductions, and the other part did not want to. It was a political football, and there are people that were wanting to do more pure research and less application engineering, wanted to kill Project Storm Fury. So they built up an artificial barrier that prevented hurricanes from ever qualifying to be experimented or seeded for damage reduction. I am terribly disappointed that the government have decided a long time ago not to do this, not to do the hurricane damage reduction anymore. The men, the materials, the aircraft, and all of the other support equipment you need are available today to reduce the damages of hurricanes very significantly, and I'm talking significantly as being more than 35 or 40%. The roof doesn't lift off the house until about 105 miles an hour. If you reduce the damages in hurricanes by 35 or 40%, you're going to save 90% of the damage that's done by them. Because once you get down below 100 miles an hour, there's not a whole lot of damage occurs from the winds and hurricanes. The tack they've taken is that they're willing to spend money they haven't got to repair places that are not repairable, or the people to evacuate and the people come back and their house is blown away. We think that's foolishness. We think that we ought to be trying to save those houses, let the people evacuate, but have them come back to a house with the furniture in it. Our aircraft can carry over 400 cloud seeding units. Now, those back in Project Storm Fury days could only carry 52. And the fact that we fly 2.5 times as fast and we know exactly where we are all the time, we feel like we have a much better opportunity, or better chance of reducing these hurricanes by even more than they were able to in Storm Fury. Well, the problem we have right now is that while we've contacted every senator in the U.S. Senate, all 100 of them, we've had one mediocre response from one of them. You get the impression that they just don't care what happens about the hurricanes, and we have presented a proposal to them to do hurricane damage reduction for the year 2006, and it amounts to around $6,000 a month. But we have enough airplanes, we have enough people in our company that we can do that. We need to be out there seeding these hurricanes, and if we don't get the results that we think we're going to get, then we can say we're not ready for it. But that's not going to be the case.
The other thing which many people don't realise, that commercial weather modification is a reality, and you can just go onto the internet to find companies which will do this for you. A number of US companies offer weather modification services, mainly cloud seeding and hail reduction. And one is simply www.weathermod.com, and here's the web page. And you can read there, weather modification is also commonly known as cloud seeding, cloud modification, atmospheric resource management, and precipitation management. Weather Modification Inc. specializes and excels in all aspects of this water management technology. Specifically, we offer a complete range of services, from turnkey operational programs for rainfall increase, rain enhancement, snowpack augmentation, hail damage mitigation, that's hail suppression, and fog clearing, fog dissipation, to technical assistance and or technology transfer for all of these. In addition, we can provide complete weather radar services, including interfaces with Titan full sky radar data archival software, a complete line of proven and FAA approved seeding equipment, seeding aircraft, atmospheric research, instrumentation, and aircraft modification for these purposes. So it's commercially available. But really that section is put there to show you that it's all out in the open. You can modify the weather. I would imagine really that overall it's not 100% reliable, the chemical method, because you don't quite know what effects the chemicals are going to have. Obviously they will be better at it now than maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but it is chemical weather modification that we've just been discussing. Where we really have to sort of focus more serious attention, I think, is on this area, which was to do with orgone energy and Cloudbusters and Wilhelm Reich. And his research started in the sort of late 40s, early 50s and continued through to the 1960s. So here we're going to look at energetic rather than chemical weather modification. Now, who was Wilhelm Reich? Well, Wilhelm Reich, I think, was a genius. Some people might dispute that, but I think he was a genius. He discovered a form of energy called orgone energy. It seems to be the energy from which everything else is made. Possible alternative names may be etheric energy, zero-point energy, vacuum energy, and Reich also studied it in relation to human sexuality, so he kind of linked this energy into its relationship with human consciousness, I suppose you'd say, at one level, because sexuality is a particular part of our consciousness. And it was in this area, studying human sexuality, that he worked as an assistant to Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist. So that shows the sort of caliber of people Reich was working with. This isn't just a backroom boy. Reich constructed and conducted experiments with devices that he called orgone accumulators. So it's worth looking at these. And we've got a picture here to try and explain what an orgone accumulator is. Orgone accumulators have alternating layers of organic, that's living or once living, and inorganic material. So an example of an organic material might be something like grass, and an example of an inorganic material might be something like metal. Now, what Reich discovered when he made these boxes in this manner was that if he put a thermometer on the outside of an orgone accumulator and he put a thermometer on the outside of just an ordinary metal box without these layers, then there was a temperature difference, and there was no way to actually account for this temperature difference, because there was no way that the radiation incident on the box should have been more efficiently reflected or stored by these boxes. And he did this experiment various times and found that this was anomalous. Now, some years later, Dr. Eugene Malov became interested in the story of Wilhelm Reich and in Reich's research into orgone energy. Dr. Eugene Malov believed that current physics based on quantum mechanics and relativity is almost completely wrong, or at least really, maybe that's not quite a fair statement. He believes that it's only an approximation of what's actually the truth, as it were. He became interested in Wilhelm Reich's work following his examination of working orgone accumulators. And these orgone accumulators ran motors, so he had no explanation for how these little motors could be running. They weren't great big huge things. He had been working with other rebel scientists since the early 1990s to try to develop cold fusion and other free energy technologies for general use. He was president of the non-profit New Energy Foundation Incorporated. He held a master's degree of science and a bachelor's degree of science in the aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he held a science doctorate in environmental sciences from Harvard University. He worked for high-technology engineering companies such as Hughes Research Laboratories, TASC, the Analytical Science Corporation, and MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He was chief science writer at the MIT News Office when cold fusion erupted, and here we have a clip of Dr. Malov discussing Wilhelm Reich and orgone energy and orgone accumulators.
Wilhelm Reich, a brilliant man that he was, an unusual man, because remember, he did come out of a sexual psychiatric orientation, right? With
yes.
Sigmund Freud. So who is some person like that to say anything about physics?
Right.
Well,
right.
in 1941, a brilliant fellow that he was, he brought some interesting observations to Einstein. He actually had 4.5 hours with Einstein. By the way, this meeting is virtually absent from all accounts of the biography of Einstein.
Why? Because of what happened
Reich
to Reich?
was later disparaged. He died in prison, remember?
Yeah, okay.
He was turned into, just like cold fusion, an insane pathological man.
Do you think Einstein took some ideas from him?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Einstein, he asked Professor Einstein, a colleague, of course, in the fight against fascism. Remember, this was early 1941, before the United States got into the war.
Right,
But,
okay.
Of course, both of them were opposed to the Nazis, obviously. And
well aware of what was
and well
going on.
aware of the possibility. So Einstein, to his credit, felt that all possibilities should be explored in the possible quest to find ways to deal with perhaps war technology and what have you. His letter later on to President Roosevelt obviously helped the Manhattan Project get going.
Mm-hmm.
But here was Reich showing him a simple experiment whereby a mercury thermometer, very accurate mercury thermometer, on the surface of what we call a Faraday cage, a steel enclosure, was higher and remained higher throughout the day than a similar mercury thermometer suspended in air. Okay, now this sounds, your listeners even who don't know about this may say, well, that sounds crazy. What could that possibly show? Well, careful experiments by Dr. Paulo and Alexandra Correa in Canada confirming this type of experiment, and in fact, giving it an even worse bias against being seen. In other words, not having the orgone accumulating layers of material around the Faraday cage, just using bare steel boxes, so to speak. In their laboratory, they have found persisting, round-the-clock, elevated temperatures on the metal Faraday cage, even in a darkened room. Now, when I first saw their ether motors and their PAGD, okay, I was obviously motivated to go back and study Reich. Prior to that, I had no interest in Reich. But I wondered, well, God, I mean, could Einstein have missed in 1941 a profound discovery? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Yep.
And we cover this in our issue 37. He brought it to Einstein. Einstein confirmed, I repeat, confirmed that there was a 0.3 of a degree or more elevation on the Faraday cage. But his assistant, Einstein's assistant, Leopold Infeld, poo-pooed it. He did some half-baked experiments to suggest that, oh yes, it's a simple explanation as to why this elevated temperature is there. And he pushed Einstein away from thinking about it, and thus broke the connection, the critical connection between Einstein and Reich, which if it had persisted, and if Einstein had behaved himself and continued the correspondence, Reich did write many letters, technical letters, to Einstein, pleading with him to reevaluate the assertions, the glib assertions of Leopold Infeld.
Tragically, Dr. Malov was murdered on the 17th of May 2004. And what I might mention at this point is how this ties in with 9/11 and 9/11 being an inside job, which you can find in other videos, because there is a Professor Stephen E. Jones who has been involved with 9/11 Truth, and this in particular the discussion and research of this thermite theory, in that thermite was used to destroy the World Trade Center towers. Dr. Stephen E. Jones was also involved in cold fusion research around the time of Pons and Fleischmann, and there's a very close correspondence between the modus operandi of Stephen E. Jones in both these areas, which are both very important to our future. So, one of the other things which Reich was looking at in great detail was something he called a cloudbuster. In March 2006, Peter Robbins gave a presentation about Wilhelm Reich, orgone energy, cloudbusters, and the UFO connection. Robbins also included information about cloudbusters. Larry Warren said they were installed at Bentwaters Base. And here is a segment from that presentation.
The cloudbuster is made up of a series of long metal pipes grounded in deep or running water by attached lengths of hollow industrial BX cable. When properly and responsibly employed, it is capable of altering weather patterns in the surrounding atmosphere. The principle it operates under is deceptively simple. The elevated pipes create atmospheric movement by drawing down atmospheric energy and harmlessly grounding it in deep water or running water. And usually the cables are submerged in a deep well. This movement is actually capable of breaking up stagnant weather fronts by attracting moisture-rich air into the area and to the locations en route of the direction as you go. I know how this may sound to some of you, but I have to tell you, I've seen a cloudbuster demonstrated, and it was on a quiet hillside in southern New Jersey more than 20 years ago, and certainly one of the most shattering afternoons I ever remember. I saw a cloudbuster operator change the entire complexion of the sky above me in less than 15 minutes, vaporizing clouds, moving cloud banks, and at the end, just by way of demonstration, creating a brief and momentary wind that was so intense it blew our hats off.
Reich observed a working cloudbuster could also have a negative biological effect upon the operator, and there's a chap called James DeMeo has confirmed this personally. James DeMeo has built cloudbusters of his own, as you can see on the picture on the right hand side here. This one's from, I believe, 1989 or 1999. I can't read the date very clearly on that, unfortunately, but you'll be able to find that on the internet. DeMeo says that Reich noted certain symptoms of overcharge and other problems which are at the very least a nuisance to this work. At worst, they would be life-threatening. Several persons using cloudbusters have been made severely ill, to the point they could no longer do it. DeMeo says, I take all kinds of precautions, including the use of electrical motors and a remote control so I can stand off by 100 feet and not get close to the device when it is working. We don't know what the long-term health effects are of this device upon the operator, and it might be similar to what the early experimenters in atomic energy suffered through. DeMeo says he was sickened temporarily on a few occasions, but he feels confident about his protective measures. Now, somebody tried to reproduce Reich's experiments in the 1960s. Charles R. Kelly, Dr. Charles R. Kelly, repeated some of Reich's cloudbuster experiments, and he said, the results of my experiments are perfectly clear. The Reich weather control apparatus does exactly what Reich claims it does. Clouds at which the antenna is pointed shrink and disappear from the sky, while comparable clouds selected as controls do not. Figures 1 and 2 are representative of results that I have obtained again and again. And here is figure 1 on the top and figure 2 at the bottom. So we can see that the cloud in the middle there where he pointed his device has disappeared, where the others remain, essentially there. There isn't as much change in those. But you can see more. You'd really need to see more details of this and look at this web page at the bottom. Now it's interesting to try and follow up not only the research of these people like Reich when they stumble across things which seem to be quite contrary to the other discoveries in science and are often treated with ridicule. So what happened to Reich? Peter Robbins gives us some of the story.
Reich's contempt trial could easily be made the subject of a longer talk than the one I am giving right now, but here are the basics of what transpired. The FDA, as you'll recall, first became interested in him shortly after Mildred Brady's article appeared in 1947, but making the case stick was proving relatively difficult. Absolutely none of Reich's past or current patients, nor any of the patients seeing the other physicians Reich had trained in medical orgone therapy, had ever registered a complaint to the FDA, or for that matter with any other agency. Neither had Reich or his associates broken any laws, but the FDA remained undeterred in their efforts. After all, they knew he was a fraud and saw their responsibility as bringing this sex-obsessed medical menace to justice. So it was that the Food and Drug Administration went to federal court and brought a complaint against the interstate shipment of orgone energy accumulators or any other related therapeutic materials. Their big break came in 1955 when the physician who had accompanied the irradiated material out to Arizona, Dr. Michael Silvert, either through absent-mindedness, terrible forgetfulness, just human frailty, shipped an orgone energy accumulator interstate out of Maine to New York. Now, they could not touch them in Maine, but once this device, which they declared a quackery, had crossed state lines, they had broken a new federal law. And upon consideration, Reich decided, even though he was in Arizona at the time, that he should take personal responsibility and take Dr. Silvert off the hook. He then wrote to the judge explaining his decision, noting he was aware that his argument might be rejected. It was, and the violation stood. FDA agents began appearing at this point on Reich's Maine property, but he refused to allow them any access to his scientific equipment or written materials and continued on with his experiments. This resulted in a contempt of court citation. Now, while their original legal parry had been a civil matter, it had now graduated to become a criminal action, and the court date was set. The betrayal of both of his lawyers likely influenced Reich's decision to represent himself in court. This was against the advice of his closest associates, especially as he had decided to make the trial a forum for the validity of his research and findings. A courageous but very naive and unfortunately destructive decision. Eloquent though he was, the judge would have none of it. In May of '56, Wilhelm Reich was convicted of contempt of court and sentenced to 2 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He was 59 years old. Beginning that year and continuing into the final months of the Eisenhower administration, the Food and Drug Administration confiscated and burned more than 8 tons of Reich's hardcover books, scientific journals, and any other assorted work that even mentioned orgone energy on the flyleaf. The FDA's only criteria was that appearance of that phrase orgone energy anywhere in the text. Editions of books having nothing to do with the subject were burned because it appeared on the jacket promoting another book. To the best of our knowledge, all of the above came to pass without the FDA ever once attempting to replicate any of Reich's experiments, build an accumulator, build a cloudbuster. It just never happened. Once incarcerated, prison authorities determined that the new inmate should undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Staff psychiatrist noted that he gave no concrete evidence of being mentally incompetent, but officially diagnosed him as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia anyway. This while admitting their findings were, quote, not based on physical evaluation, end quote. Wilhelm Reich was found dead in his cell at Lewisburg on November 3rd, 1957, just 7 days prior to his scheduled release.
Now, just as another little aside here, it's worth considering how I think knowledge of these things sometimes works. We do occasionally find little snippets of important knowledge hidden away in perhaps unexpected places. And I distinctly remember first being told about Wilhelm Reich in the 80s and 1980s. I never really did any research because it was much more difficult then, because you had to go and find books and things. But this is one such instance of that. Here we have a song from 1985, and it's called Cloud Busting, and it's on the album Hounds of Love, and it's by Kate Bush.
I still dream of walking on. I wake up crying, you're making rain, and you're just in reach. When you in sleep escape me, you're like my yo-yo that glowed in the dark. What made it special, made it dangerous, so I bury it and forget. But every time it rains, you're here in my head, like the sun coming out. Ooh, I just know that something good is gonna happen. I don't know when, but just saying it could even make it happen.
And if you listen to the rest of that song, you'll hear a few references to him being chased by the government or hiding from the government. So there is a bit of a story of Reich in a popular song. Organon, by the way, was the name of the sort of farm or ranch which he set up and went to live there, where he did his experiments. And I think it is worth remembering that perhaps just saying it could even make it happen. Now we'll move on to something which is perhaps a possible offshoot of Reich's work. And this is quite well known of. It is the HAARP technology. It's a large-scale project, and though most attention seems to be focused on the one in Alaska, which is very well known about and fully disclosed, it appears there may be more than one of these units around the world, perhaps as many as 10 different installations at a guess. Now, this is the picture of the one in Alaska, and it's called the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, not Oral Research Program. And it's an investigation project to understand, simulate and control ionospheric processes that might alter the performance of communication and surveillance systems. That is its disclosed purpose. It started in 1993, and the project was proposed to last for a period of 20 years. The project is jointly funded by the United States Air Force, the Navy, and the University of Alaska, so it is within the confines of the Department of Defense. It is said that the project is similar to numerous existing ionospheric heaters around the world and has a large suite of diagnostic instruments that facilitate its use to increase scientific understanding of ionospheric dynamics. It is a popular target of conspiracy theories. Yeah, there's a phrase. And though many have expressed fears of the HAARP being used as a nefarious weapon, the scientists involved in astronomy, space science, or plasma physics reject these fears as unfounded. So the message that you can take from that is that be afraid of potential terrorist attacks, which might happen at any time, with these dark, suspicious characters, but don't be afraid of us, in other words, the Department of Defense, pumping 1 billion watts of energy into the upper atmosphere just to see what will happen. Because that's what they're doing. The disclosed amount is much smaller, but the potential that they have in terms of energy generation is 1 billion watts of energy can be pumped into the HAARP array and aimed into the atmosphere.
But there are other weather-related technologies that have a darker side. Bernard Eastland is a plasma physicist, former fusion researcher for the US Atomic Energy Commission, and inventor, who has 3 weather control patents. Eastland's speciality is revolutionary mechanisms of energy transfer. That was exactly the reason that the Atlantic Richfield Oil Company approached him with a unique problem to solve.
I was originally hired by ARCO in about 1984 to find a use of their natural gas on the North Slope of Alaska. They have 23 trillion cubic feet of natural gas.
To put this in perspective, that's enough gas to power the entire American electrical grid for 1 year. But its location was so remote, there was no economically feasible way to transport it.
Dr. Eastland had been contracted with them to find a way to exploit the natural gas on the North Slope. In other words, to convert natural gas to money, but first to turn it to electricity and then radio frequency energy.
I came up with the idea of using the energy in the gas to make electricity, and to use the electricity to power a large phased array antenna that could modify the ionosphere in different ways.
Eastland's massive antenna array was called HAARP, the High Frequency Active Aural Research Project.
The claims being made about the technology were such that it was almost unbelievable.
Although the HAARP antenna array looks unremarkable, its capabilities are not. HAARP is one of the few man-made devices capable of heating the Earth's ionosphere. The ionosphere is an enveloping layer of charged particles located 145 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. The charged particles in the ionosphere perform an important function for the planet. They deflect and absorb the solar wind, the toxic onslaught of deadly particles thrown at us by the sun. Without the ionosphere, life as we know it on Earth would perish. Eastland's plan was to pump energy derived from natural gas directly into the ionosphere. The stated goal was communications research. ARCO immediately understood the genius in Eastland's idea, and thanks to his patent, they were contracted by the US military to build this incredible device.
It's a very good research facility. It's minuscule compared to the size of the antenna I suggested in my patents. However, it's the first piece of what could become something bigger.
But even in its current incarnation, it's the largest ionospheric heater in the world, capable of heating a 1,000 square kilometer area of the ionosphere to over 50,000 degrees.
It's also a phased array, which means it's steerable and it can point where it wants to point. You can make those waves go where you want.
What they have found is that by sending radio frequency energy up and focusing it as they do with these kinds of instruments, it causes a heating effect. And that heating literally lifts the ionosphere within a 30-mile diameter area, therein changing localized pressure systems, or perhaps the route of jet streams. The idea of moving a jet stream is a phenomenal event in terms of man being able to do this. The problem is we cannot model the system adequately.
Long-term consequences of ionospheric heating are unknown.
Changing weather in one place can have a devastating downstream effect.
And HAARP has already been accused of modifying the weather. An article in Scientific American pointed out that a strange shift in the jet stream directly over Gakona, Alaska, pushed colder air southward, causing a rare tornado outbreak in Florida. As a weapon of war, HAARP's possible uses are daunting.
Think about a 100,000-person army and your opposition, and say you could hit them with flooding rains and horrible conditions in terms of weather for several weeks, maybe months. You can degrade their ability to perform in the battlefield.
HAARP has other implications as a multi-purpose weapon. Using ionospheric manipulation, it could disrupt enemy radio and cellular communication. It could even be used to sense, differentiate, and directly destroy enemy missiles.
That's where war is headed in the 21st century. That's where these systems are headed in the 21st century.
HAARP's potential role as a secret weapon of war has long been known in military circles. Numerous countries have lodged complaints against its use, pointing to it as an obvious violation of the treaty outlawing environmental modification for weapons applications.
The last 3 secretaries of defense have all called for the elimination, the dropping of this environmental treaty. This treaty was well thought out in the early 70s, ratified by our Congress in 78. That treaty needs to stay in effect.
Through all of the controversy, HAARP scientists have maintained that the array is intended only for pure research, and that it has nowhere near the power necessary to truly change the weather. However, as the results would be classified anyway, the jury is still out.
So that was a clip explaining a bit more about HAARP. Now, just to give you a bit more information, the program is described as a scientific endeavour aimed at studying the properties and behaviour of the ionosphere, with particular emphasis on being able to understand and use it to enhance communications and surveillance systems, which I've already said. The site that the HAARP facility is built on is owned by the US Department of Defense, and a 2.5 megawatt diesel generator will be used to power HF transmitters, in other words high frequency. The disclosed usage is 2.5 megawatts, which is still a lot, but it's actually a lot higher. No official link to chemtrails is stated. This is obvious. Chemtrails do not officially exist. But if you listen to what Clifford Carnicom has to say about the matter, he has looked at Eastland's patent for the HAARP technology and its relationship to chemtrails, and believes that there is a strong link which is likely between these two things. So what is HAARP really for? Again, you can go onto the website and read the information which they tell you it's for, which is harp.alaska.edu is one website. There is another one as well. But let's listen to what Dr. Nick Begich has to say.
In your opinion, Nick, what do you think HAARP is being used for?
Well, I think the thing that the military says, obviously, I believe what they say they are using it for. The two other areas which they don't get into so intensely are more areas of greater concern. What they talk about is surveillance applications for over-the-horizon radar. They're talking about using it potentially for studies to determine ionospheric characteristics and being able to influence the ionosphere, manipulate it in different ways. All of that is confirmed in the military literature. The two areas that get very controversial, one showed up in a technical memorandum that wasn't supposed to be publicly released, but it was non-classified, actually talked about the use of this technology for weather modification or weather control, and that became a pretty big issue for the European Parliament and a big issue later for the Russian Duma, both which passed resolutions opposing HAARP specifically for this particular risk factor. The other part that comes up is the use of extremely low frequency signals for what's called earth-penetrating tomography, and this is something that MSNBC actually reported on right after 9/11, back in late November of 2001, using HAARP for this particular purpose, for looking at underground facilities in Afghanistan at the time. What people need to recognize is that the same signal range, which is approximately 1 to 40 hertz, or pulses or vibrations per second in just plain language, but these pulse rates, if they transit certain what are called window frequencies, you can trigger biological effects within the human brain that are quite dramatic, that can end up resulting in an alteration of emotional state or a number of other effects.
So that was Nick Begich discussing some of the possible uses of HAARP. It's worth pointing out, however, that Dr. Begich seems to not understand that 9/11 was an inside job, and here in this audio clip he thinks, or he says he thinks, that the invasion of Afghanistan was absolutely justified.
We're in a conflict in Iraq, as an example, and we're there to win the hearts and minds and spread democracy. But that's not what the people apparently want. They want a theocracy, and if that's what they want in their own right to self-determination, maybe we need to recognize individual sovereignty as long as they keep it within the boundaries of their country, and learn to leave people alone. We're the only country in the world with 800 bases and stations around the world to monitor and interfere with everyone else's politics. Maybe it's time to pull back a little bit towards our own borders, allow some governments to function. If they violate another state, if they violate the United States, I say stomp them into the Stone Age, as we did in Afghanistan. When we said give those guys up and they didn't do it, I think we were fully justified.
We'll now look at something which is much easier to see and talk about than things in faraway places, because you'll see these right over your head. Start off by looking at the difference between contrails and chemtrails, basically. And I'm going to read this out. Kerosene is classed as a hydrocarbon. It mainly contains alkanes, which are made up of carbon, approximately 85%, and hydrogen, approximately 12%. And oxygen, of course. There are some other compounds in kerosene which contain nitrogen and sulfur, approximately 1% or 2% each, respectively. When kerosene burns, therefore, it can only form compounds that contain elements that were originally in the kerosene, or in the air it burns in. Not surprisingly, then, the main compounds that form when kerosene burns are carbon dioxide, which is known as the infamous greenhouse gas, which we all breathe out, but that really is just another distraction that global warming is not caused by CO2. There is no real solid evidence of that, despite what's put out in the press, and that could be the subject of a separate presentation. Sulfur dioxide in small quantities, which is a toxic greenhouse gas, and it mixes with water to form acid rain, sulfurous and sulfuric acid. That's what acid rain is. And carbon monoxide is a toxic flammable gas responsible for some deaths which happen when gas heating equipment is faulty, and it's due to incomplete burning of fuel. And the other thing, of course, you get is water vapour, just like you see coming out of a car exhaust on a cold morning. When we look at each of those compounds in turn, we find that they are all colourless. Okay? So when kerosene burns, it would seem that only the visible thing we should see in the sky is the condensation, which, like our breath on a cold day, should disappear in a few tens of seconds. Indeed, when a jet takes off, we can see that only colourless compounds come out of the back. All that we see is hot air. And here is a video comparison showing the difference between contrails and chemtrails. The first section shows the ordinary contrails, which disappear in a few seconds. Now this video, on the other hand, shows chemtrails, and you can clearly see both an X pattern which moves without changing. Once the X is formed, it doesn't reform, It just moves through the sky and gradually fades away. And you will also see an ordinary contrail which disappears as the plane travels across the sky. Some people may dispute that chemtrails play a role in weather modification, but I think even when you look at them at the basic physical level on their own, in terms of the quantity of them that can appear on some days and obscure the sunlight, and indeed you then quite often get an accompanying drop in the temperature, it's quite clear that they are having an effect on the weather, even if it's only sort of quite localized and only for a short period of time. So they definitely do affect the weather, and therefore they are used for weather modification. It would seem, however, that things are happening on a bigger scale than just that as well, but it's very difficult to piece that together. But here's just a few pictures for you to look at of the chemtrails. This is a true colour picture from NASA looking back at the edge of a storm that is just clearing the West Great Lakes states. This is a very dry atmospheric environment in that the passing storm has cleared the area of available moisture for cloud formation, plus the inherent stabilisation post-storm leads to a very clear skies. So we have many thick contrails that are lasting in an environment that shouldn't support their visible existence, and that's been written by Scott Stevens from his weatherwars.info site, and he's basically saying that there is no way that those trails should stay there. They're staying for minutes. I mean, you can see the length of these trails, there's no way they should be staying there. And you can even see that they cast shadows on the ground. So this is just crazy stuff. And again, we have another picture which was on Jeff Chalander's site, Project Prove, and he points out here the grid pattern, and this picture was taken at a minimum altitude of 150 miles, that's about 250 kilometers, and from an angle we are looking at an atmospheric phenomenon which is at least 300 miles or 500 kilometers from the lens. Ordinary normal contrails could not and would not be visible from such a distance. In any case, contrails would never last long enough to create this blanket of material over such a wide area. And from whence does all the mass come from? We're looking at millions of tons of material to make a layer like this in the atmosphere. We can only guess how many square miles or kilometers of continental territory are shown in this photograph, but the area seen is huge. And all of this is caused by mere jet engine exhaust? I don't think so, and I would agree with Jeff Challenger on that. There is no way that you can get that sort of effect from jet engine exhaust alone. There is something else going on. And again, this picture is another NASA picture showing a weird selection of trails all over those few states shown there. And again, another one from Europe at a minimum altitude of 150 miles, and it's probably much higher since we can see entire countries here. We can make out the lower part of the Danish peninsula at the top of the picture. Note the spray activity is concentrated mostly over Germany. Once again, simple jet engine exhaust cannot account for this much mass. You'll find in a separate video, either on my Google video account or my YouTube account, which is ADJ UK, I made a video of a set of spraying which took place on the 4th of February 2007 near where I live, which is near Derby in the UK. And we've also now got a similar satellite picture to the one shown here, that we've seen these trails both from space and on the same day at around the same time when I took pictures of them from the ground. Just a few more snapshots here really. This is a NOAA picture. Battle Creek, Michigan, 2004. The day begins without a cloud in the sky until the planes appear, and so often they fly in pairs. Well, I often see them come after one after another. They don't sort of fly in parallel where I am, but this is fairly unusual to see this much of a set of parallel lines. And this wasn't an air show, folks. Here's one from Redding, California. We've got a mixture of different types of trails which are spread out there. We've got a fairly clear one there, one which is older, which is spread out more, and here too. And then we've got this effect here. And this is one I took in the Lake District in the UK, as you can see on that date. It's quite a busy day, that, chemtrail wise. And then I did like a panorama shot. I took a couple of pictures together, and this was 24th of Jan 2006. A friend I know in Yorkshire, which is in northern England, he took this picture. We can see some particular design of trails there, and what that's meant to achieve I don't know, but it's not an accident. And again, the same friend took this picture, and here we see the line effect again. Paris. And then the one which really made me wake up when I took this, and this was on the 10th of June, and there is no way that this is an ordinary set of air traffic. No way. It's not possible to have this being caused by ordinary air traffic. I mean, to me, you'd think that was an air show or something, but this was 9:45 p.m. in the evening, right outside my window, which is about 6 miles outside Derby. And I've marked up on this picture. This picture is slightly zoomed out from the previous one. I took two whilst I had the opportunity, and I've counted it, as you can see, marked up there approximately 9, maybe even 10 different trails. Could probably mark another one here on this area. So 9 different trails, several of them intersecting, as you can clearly see. It makes no sense in terms of ordinary air traffic. So how long do these chemtrails last? Well, it's quite easy these days to do some time-lapse photography, which is what I did to try and measure this. And I found here that they last at least 18 minutes. This is what I actually measured with this. So I've got a chemtrail coming in at 14:30 on the laptop's clock timer. Goes across the frame, and it leaves at approximately 14:48. So I know that trail has lasted at least 18 minutes. And some other film here from Las Vegas.
There is the Las Vegas Space Needle, stratosphere. Now what I want to bring out before this day, Monday, June 20th, is the fact that, look, as we go up, look at that. The military has been out here with all these chemtrails. On the outskirts of Las Vegas. It stopped laying it, and it continued to lay it. Wow, man, that's where it started. Why we don't see the trail going on all over the mountains? Well, that's the outskirts of Las Vegas. They laying all these trails up over the sky to the other end of Las Vegas, and it stops. Now, this trail started like right there on the outskirts of Las Vegas. Now look. Wow, Benjamin. We have really tapped into the sources that deep. We have discovered them seeding out area with fake clouds to keep it known from being known. They have now see why ABC TV 13 here is backed out. One right behind the other. 5, 6, 7, 8 of these big-time jets all crisscrossing the skies. They're not regular airport jets. They're not headed toward the airport. They're not coming from the airport. They're not on any of the airport routes. But they all are going back and forth from Nellis. They're flying to and from Nellis Air Force Base. Wow, man, how many more is it up there? Now look at this. Military planes. As if they're watching us. They're not seeding. As if they are commanding the operation. Communicating with everybody, man. Somebody don't want the skies clear over Las Vegas. But they're going to have to do more than that because I'm not giving up. Billions of tons dropped in the clear skies over major populations because the military knows that that Yahweh's angels are here and trying to get our attention. Billions of tons, and we wonder why the weather changes. Billions of tons, and we a day, probably a year. Billions of tons of chemicals, and we wondering why the atmosphere and ozone levels and everything are all messed up, man. Now look at this. Look at that chemtrail there. Now, if you look at the direction it's headed across Las Vegas, you see that it didn't leave a chemtrail anywhere. This one waited real late until it got in the midst of a cloud to start releasing it. Had that been something that would just normally happen from flight, fumes, the trail should have been traceable all the way over, coming across the sky. But like the rest of them, they all start in the location of the city limits of Las Vegas. This one started real late. Most of them would have started at least over there somewhere, but this one started clearly right in the midst of that cloud, as if they're trying to let us know.
So, we've seen the chemtrails. What about the planes? These things are coming out of planes, so what's going on? Well, we seem to see a variety of planes actually dumping this stuff out. Here's one. I think it looks like something like a C-130 maybe. In contrast to the ordinary commercial jet I recorded in flight on 16th February 2005, here is what appears to be a US Air Force cargo jet, possibly a C-130. This is the pattern we see when a plane is spraying chemtrails. Please note that the exhaust comes from the entire wingspan of the wings. There is a heavily concentrated plume directly from the tail in the centre as well, and there are no engines. Please compare this craft with the one in the previous series of pictures showing a regular contrail. Well, you can clearly see that that is the amount of trails coming out of that is just crazy. We can actually see, for example, 4 engines, 1, 2, 3, 4, obviously, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 streams, apparent streams. So this does not look like a regular contrail. And again, thick trails, greatly exaggerated from what you would expect. A few pictures like this now. Unmarked planes, obviously taken from quite close in this instance. No markings at all. Very unusual. This wispy effect, which I've seen from the ground several times. This wavy contrail. Another wide, thick trail. And another. And another seemingly left below this bank of trail here, which has started to spread out. More. And we even had a TV news report last year, which I tend to think is a kind of disclosure. They're admitting that this is real, but they're not telling you what it's about. But they are admitting that it is real. And this was on NBC News LA, 16th of May 2006.
Tonight, a community in the San Bernardino Mountains has a real mystery on its hands. The official explanation here is that jet contrails are causing strange lines in the sky, and that it's pollen making people sick on the ground. But others are convinced it is something else, and they ask, is the government experimenting with our weather?
There was a huge dust cloud.
Longtime Cedar Glen resident Gretchen Sherman says she has never seen anything like it.
How big was it? Oh, it covered the entire Cedar Glen area.
A cloud of dust, leaving a sticky yellow slime all over her car. It happened again last February, and calls began pouring into the local Alpenhorn newspaper.
And they had a tremendous upsurge of children that were not going to school at that time.
Pharmacist Ed Burrows says it is the most mysterious illness he's seen in 22 years on the mountain.
A lot of eye infection problems, upper respiratory problems, nosebleeds.
The nearby March Air Force Base say it didn't come from them. Others said it was a pollen cloud. The Department of Health found a yellowish tint on a tissue submitted for testing. But, quote, there was no sign of any biological form, such as cedar pollen, and the test was ruled inconclusive. And it wasn't long before things ballooned into a sky-high mystery. The story is not just here in Crestline in the alleged yellow cloud. People say the government is up there in airplanes spraying all kinds of chemicals to change or manipulate the weather, leaving what you see there, and they call that a chemtrail. So what I look at there and I think are contrails, you're telling me are chemtrails?
Yes, that a contrail would be dissipated by now.
It would?
Yes, it would.
Chemtrails. On the internet, they are cited as proof of the government creating clouds to combat global warming. In response, the Air Force says that, quote, there is no such thing as a chemtrail. The actual contrails are a safe and natural phenomenon. And that people are seeing more contrails simply because there are more jets forming large clouds, depending on weather conditions, as in this video of alleged chemtrails shot near San Francisco.
I think these are contrails.
Professor Gregory Benford of UC Irvine works with the Department of Energy on weather research.
That's very odd. They could be very large contrails.
He says the DOE doesn't know of any jets spraying chemicals to affect the weather. However, he says we will probably see it in the near future.
You've got to, in a sense, engineer all these so you get the right kind of clouds for the effects we want.
It is called geoengineering, fighting global warming by putting a chemical dust in the atmosphere and reflecting harmful radiation back into space.
You could use barium oxide, for example, which makes big fluffy clouds. You could use tiny little bits of aluminum, which is benign in the environment, and essentially manage the climate.
And what I found was unusual spiking since the early 1990s in barium, aluminum.
But Rosalind Peterson of California Skywatch says health department records show a sharp increase in both chemicals in the water supply of Northern California, dating from the time the huge contrails first appeared over her home in Mendocino County. What's the significance of the barium and the aluminum?
I went and got all the tests, and all these things in the same test would be up way over state and federal standards. It had to be airborne, because how could it get to such diverse regions of our county? We have jets going in every direction. X's, east, west, north, south, circles. There is something going on in the air. I don't know exactly what, but I think there's some experimentation.
Is it legal?
I don't know because we haven't had a public discussion.
But what is unknown today may be actual fact tomorrow, thanks to a bill soon to be voted on in the U.S. Senate, a Weather Modification Act, calling for research in, quote, attempting to change or control by artificial methods the natural development of atmospheric cloud forms. Doesn't it seem to you that they're going to be doing it in the future for sure?
Yes. And if they are, I want to know about it.
In the meantime, a lot of people are wondering if they'll ever get clear skies and a clear answer. The legislation is there, therefore somebody's thinking about this. How does this make sense?
I don't know, maybe they're practicing.
Over Cedar Glen, over Arrowhead.
I guess you have to try it out before you use it. I'm not sure.
Well, you be the judge. We'll keep you posted on anything further on the story, and there will be more, that's for sure. More information on the weather modification proposals, check on our website, nbc4.tv.
Now, there's another disturbing aspect to this, which is that you come across recounts of fibres falling from the air too. And this has been reported in a number of instances. Some people have reported that spiders' webs fall in the middle of winter. And Clifford Carnicom and William Thomas discussed them and the related issues.
Sometimes in the morning, at least in St. Louis, I would see what looked like massive spider webs all over bushes and shrubs, up in trees. And so I'm saying, well, you know, spiders have been working their heads off at night. But I'm also beginning to think, William, what are the possibilities that whatever this stuff is, fiber, is coming from the plains?
I think you're right on target with that. In my book that you mentioned, Chemtrails Confirmed, I describe an incident similar to what you're describing at the Denver airport, and a police officer's uniform was literally covered with this stuff. They told him the same story. Oh, those are overactive spiders. Maybe they need some Prozac or something. But it was December. There were no spiders. I called Bernard Eastland at his home in Texas and asked him about his invention called HAARP, working away up there in Alaska. And later, I called him back and I said, what about these fibers? Could these be some kind of polymer being sprayed into the air for this HAARP transmitter to bounce its signal off of? And he says, well, absolutely, that could be the case. We can fine-tune the polymers you're mentioning, which don't dissolve, by the way, like spider webs in your hand. We can fine-tune them to the HAARP frequencies and bounce HAARP signals all over the United States and very possibly beyond. So we on the chemtrails investigation, believe that these polymers, and we've tried to lab test them without much result, these are polymers, and we think that they are involved with the HAARP experiments in Alaska.
Give me some possibilities now, William. Let's say three of your top theories on chemtrails, with maybe the last one being what you think they may be.
Oh, you know what? I can't bite on that. After 8 years, George, with respect, I don't have theories. At this point, I am going with the climate modification and, leading off your question, underlying inadvertent biological warfare. In effect, it is my theory, and this so-called theory, this speculation, was seconded without prompting by one of the scientists working on the chemtrails project at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when he was interviewed by a friend of mine, award-winning journalist Bob Fitzrakis, for Columbus Alive magazine, and he expressed concern that chemtrails were bringing down from the upper atmosphere viruses, bacteria, and fungi that scientists have recently learned have been living and breeding up there for apparently millennia, being bombarded by UV, as you can appreciate, and mutating so that our immune systems would not recognize these pathogens. And the scientist was concerned, as I am, that chemtrails would inadvertently be bringing these things down to ground level, making people very ill, which in fact is what we are seeing. Hospital emergency rooms crowded with people suffering from asthma, allergies, heart problems, lung problems, not caused only by the small particulate size of the chemtrails themselves, the chemicals, but by these airborne pathogens. As we know, the Internet is filled with theories about biowarfare and culling the population. Our lab tests do not show this to be happening. However, I would call it inadvertent biowarfare, and since we're 8 years into this, and the people doing it know about the hospital admissions, they know about the deaths of the elderly, they continue to do this, well, at that point, it no longer becomes inadvertent.
Can we reverse this, William, and say maybe they're trying to kill these viruses up there with some kind of chemical?
there would be no need. They stay up there. They don't bother anybody. If they did precipitate out on their own, they primarily fall into the oceans. We're on a planet that is really a water world of some 3/4 oceans. I'm an ocean sailor. I've seen quite a bit of it. These critters would come down and not hurt anyone, and in fact, scientists have collected quite a few of them off our coastal waters, so there's no need to go after them.
So your top thought on chemtrails would be climate modification.
Absolutely. Remember, this whole thing was brought on by the late Dr. Edward Teller at an international conference on planetary emergencies way back in '98, when climate change, global warming started to get really, literally heat up, bringing tropical fish off the beaches of Washington coast, near where I'm speaking tonight, Scotland, hurricanes, record-breaking winds. Teller stood up and said, we need to put a sunscreen up that will deflect 1% of incoming sunlight and chill out this global warming before it becomes a runaway phenomena. It was the environmental consultant Mike Castle who came up with the patent issued to Hughes Aircraft in '94, calling for just such a sunscreen to be spread by jet aircraft using aluminum oxide particles, very fine particles. We've also found quartz and barium particles in actual lab tests of chemtrail fallout, all of these very highly reflectant.
And here's Clifford Carnicom.
In one case, the samples were seen falling from the sky. The first sample occurred in eastern Oregon and the second in the Sacramento area. Two separate parties at two separate times were, let's say, affected enough by the appearance of this material on the ground and or in the air to collect it. And looking for a place to send to, they became familiar with my name as a research person in this field. So at the end of November, I was the recipient of two samples from two separate parties from two separate locations at two separate times. Neither of these parties knew one another and still don't, to my knowledge. I began an analysis of that material at that time and was immediately, let's say, struck by some unusual qualities or characteristics of that material. These characteristics are best summarized by describing the size of this material. The material is composed of fibers. It's a fibrous material, white in nature. And I was struck to put this material under a microscope as soon as possible. And the most, let's say, the most prominent characteristic which shows up immediately is the size of these fibers. These fibers are incredibly small. I have eventually had them measured as being less than 1 micron in width. 1 micron is an astounding number. To give the audience a frame of reference or a comparison, a human hair is roughly in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 microns in thickness. A line of cotton, a cotton thread, is roughly 10 microns in thickness, and a spider web is approximately 7 microns in width, at least the ones I've measured. The material I'm speaking of is less than 1 micron in width. There are little to no fibers of my knowledge, natural fibers of this size. Asbestos might be the nearest candidate, which should be in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 microns thick. So the size of this material, thickness of it, is certainly an unusual characteristic which warrants further investigation. A second characteristic of this material is that it is extremely adhesive. It's very difficult to separate contact with the material once it is made. If you're using a microscope slide and a needle, it would often take 2 to 3 passes to get this fiber to adhere to a glass slide. And a third characteristic would be what would best be described as a synthetic nature having a wavy form. And this is a microscopically wavy form, something that you cannot see with your eye. But I describe it as kinky or wavy in nature at a microscopic level. So these are 3 physical characteristics which appeared, which separated this material as being unique and, let's say, warranting further investigation.
Clifford Carnicom also discusses more recently the links between these fibres possibly and Morgellons disease, but I haven't put a lot of information about that into this presentation. Clifford Carnicom has done a lot of research, and he's written quite a few letters to official bodies regarding the chemtrail issue. And here's one such response that he's received from year 2000. He's written to the Environmental Protection Agency on quite a few occasions, and he's even sent them samples of material. But they keep repeatedly saying to him, the EPA is not involved in or aware of any application or aerial spraying of chemical, biological or toxic substances as claimed by your past correspondence or on the above or other website. The agency takes very seriously its mission to protect human health, etc. So they're basically just flat denial of chemtrails, which is the pattern I've encountered too. And again, writing to the Air Force, Clifford Carnicom didn't write, but it was somebody on his behalf, and it was sent to a lady called Joanne Meehan in year 2001. Within that letter it says, the term chemtrail is a hoax that began circulating approximately 4 years ago, which asserts the government is involved in a joint federal program of covert spraying of the general public. The chemtrails are most often described as unusual contrails or contrail patterns seen coming from military and civilian aircraft. The chemtrail hoax has been investigated and refuted by many established and accredited universities, scientific organisations and major media publications. But as I understand it, none of those organisations or publications are listed, or any contacts within them are listed to say how they've been refuted. Now, once you notice the chemtrails, you will see that they are real. There is no escaping that this spraying is going on. So if you watch the sky for 3 or 4 days, that when you have clear enough weather, you will see the chemtrails being made right over your head very regularly. So what can you do? Well, you can combine some of the information that's been given earlier in this presentation with some other stuff that's available on the internet, and you can make yourself a chembuster, which is like a cloudbuster. You can probably see the resemblance here. So by utilising the research of Wilhelm Reich, we have created, this is the words of Don Croft, a cheap, portable and easy to build device that consistently destroys chemtrails and heals the atmosphere. The chembuster is the answer to these ongoing attacks. Unlike the original cloudbuster, the CB changes the deadly orgone energy to good orgone energy and does not become saturated or dangerous to the operator. And he says you can build one for about $150. And there's instructions on how to build one. You can buy these, as some websites are selling these now. I've got my own, not cloudbuster, but orgone cakes, which are kind of like a cut down version, which I've put in the loft of my house. And here's an example shown working. And I'm not going to read out all these instructions, but basically you can see it's a bucket, which is a 9-inch bucket, 6 standard type M 1-inch copper pipes, 6 foot long, open at one end, and you put in a quartz crystal, double terminated with 2 pointed ends, about 2 inches long, into a 0.575 inch section of garden hose. And best to use aluminium as your metal fibres, and then you can use plywood for the template. 3/4 of an inch exterior plywood is used to make the base for the copper end caps and pipes. So that's how you space them correctly, so that you get the correct effect. So get making your own cloudbusters, folks, if you want to get rid of these chemtrails. So now we'll look at other evidence of weather modification, including more photos other than chemtrails, satellite photos, and some radar images from satellites. Now this one is rather a good one, and there's been quite a few extraordinary pictures, as I see them, of cloud anomalies over the years, which we're going to skip through in a minute. But this one appeared in 2003, and it was captured in Alabama, and it was even on the BBC News website. This is an extraordinary picture. How anyone can question what it shows as clearly an artificial activity is beyond me, really. So I'll just skip through these. JFK Airport in November 2004. Similar type of effect, a circular vortex. Very unusual. And here we have Orlando, Florida, late in the day prior to Christmas Eve. Blooming contrails, actually chemtrails, evident, with a striking oval imprint deposited into the cloud field. It truly amazes me that this whole project is still so hidden behind the important news story of the day, a sorry symptom of the state of journalism in this nation, and indeed throughout the Western world. Well, yes, you don't hear about this sort of extraordinary carry-on. This oval strike appears to be very fresh, with the cirrus fallout just in the beginning phases. Note the straight edge to the back of the cloud field northward of the oval. So we've got this thing here, I think he's saying here. That's from Scott Stevens' website, weatherwars.info. Another one. And I've actually seen one of these quite near to my house or something looking decidedly similar, but I wasn't able to photograph it because it didn't last for very long. It only lasted for 2 or 3 minutes. So we seem to be seeing the effects of some energy field impinging on the cloud pattern. That's my view on this. And again, this one from Tucson, Arizona in October 2004. So these are not isolated instances. We've got multiple records of them now. And again, you'll begin to notice, if you start looking for these effects, you tend to see them more clearly. Now, you do obviously wonder, well, you know, is it just I'm seeing patterns where there are none? But certainly instances that you've seen here, you can clearly see there are patterns. And again, these sorts of imprints on the cloud pattern. And we've got some more coming up. Now, Scott Stevens has marked up this picture, and he feels that the energy which is involved in creating cloud patterns is being moved around. And so the energy is concentrated where he's marked the plus sign, and is decreased where he's got the minus sign. And you can actually see these sorts of effects quite commonly on Sundays. There does seem to be these very wispy clouds which seem to be being pressed out in ways which doesn't look like normal cloud formations to me. I've witnessed this many times now, but it's something which is quite subtle, and you wouldn't really notice it until it's been pointed out to you. But something like this, I don't think is subtle at all. It's over the state of Washington, travelling from north to south, and the chap who took it was travelling from Canada towards Seattle, going south. Chemtrails had been sprayed all morning, and after the sky was completely clouded over, I looked up and saw this strange tunnel-type thing. It's difficult to describe how it looked, but the closest is to imagine a boat cutting through the sky, and this trail is left by this propeller spinning. I have never seen anything like this before or since. And that's from a chap called Chris B. I haven't got a date for that. Sometime in 2005, I think. More instances of cloud anomalies. And there's a particular image library with these in that I've taken these out from. So these are not isolated instances. You can see we've got another 6 of these strange circular cloud holes with this kind of wispy effect, wispy sort of fan effect in the middle. So we're definitely getting some kind of energy pattern being imprinted onto the weather. So what's that? It's weather modification. And here we have a similar pattern on video. Further to this, we've seen the particularly shaped patterns from the ground. We've also seen them from space in several instances. So here we have October the 24th, 2004, and notice how the cumulus field has formed a 90-degree bend around the two negative energy clear areas. So we've got, you can clearly see kind of a rectangular portion there and a rectangular portion there, and we've got some cloud formation around this. So you can clearly see there's some energy effect going on there of some kind. And this section is particularly interesting. Scott Stevens writes, on June the 7th, 2004, 0108, southeastern Montana, east Idaho, northwest Montana. This image was huge, finally convincing me that this project wasn't limited to individual events, but was everywhere, all the time. Soak up all the oddities, squares, and clouds at 90-degree angles. The whole storm had to have been digitized into individual cells. I've never looked at the sky the same since, Scott Stevens writes, and you'll hear some more.
What I was looking at was the cold front working through southern Montana, and
yeah, you can actually see it.
You can actually see it,
right.
And towards the end of it, it comes to just a sharp endpoint, which is fine. It looks like a needle that we used to, those old archaic things called LPs or vinyl.
Right.
But you can see how the clouds are simply notched at regular intervals.
I do.
You see how about every 4 kilometers, every 4 or 5 kilometers, they're just hatched. And it's the regular interval. And when you begin to climb up from the back of that cold front, there is an opening or a large square. And where that opening begins, the clouds are shifted exactly 90 degrees.
Oh, I do see that.
The cold front moves north. The clouds realign themselves north-southeast or north-south, and then the front continues on.
All right. When you're doing the weather on TV,
mm-hmm.
and I take it you present these sorts of images to your audience, right?
But I haven't pointed them out.
Okay,
not all the time. After doing this show, I have to. I have to.
Yes.
It changes everything. And follow the northern border of Wyoming, and across the valley that includes Billings, Montana, there's a perfectly square cloud.
Okay.
Over towards the east central or the right central portion of the image. Do you see the square cloud and the square shadow below it?
I do.
It's almost as if it's been cut out.
In fact, actually, it's almost exactly square. That is bizarre.
Exactly.
So there's nothing, in other words, normally, meteorologically speaking, there's nothing that would or could create an exact square cloud like that?
Not in that terrain. Not in that terrain. And that's not the only anomaly on the picture.
It is weird.
There are many other anomalies in that image that if you just sit and look at it, the geometry is just wrong.
Scott Stevens there. And again, no commentary needed really, particularly for these images, except that I've learned since putting this presentation together that these towers, there are towers below where these circular formations are appearing, and they're called Gwen towers. So we can clearly see the evidence of weather modification in action. We're getting a radial, circular, short-lived rainfall pattern, less than 13 minutes of rain, according to the timestamp on these pictures. We see the rain flash appear at 2:45, and it's gone by 2:58. So maybe 10-15 minutes of rain, and then it's gone. And again, these are not isolated incidents. Once you look at the data, we've got them all the time. We've got one just outside the state of Texas. I think this is the state of New Orleans, but I'm not. I should go and check that. And we've got a radial rainfall pattern here, and then we've got these linear ribs of rain here too. So maybe we're looking at a combination of effects, and we've got another southern line there too, which seems to have been superimposed on the more natural weather patterns, which are maybe here and here. So very strange. How can this be considered to be natural? And again, you can go onto the internet and find more of these images. Apparently they do have an active program of doctoring these images, so that you got to be lucky to get hold of them, but fortunately there's a number of researchers have archived them away for us. And as you see, if you look carefully, these images are all time-stamped, so we know exactly when they were taken and what the source is. So this is very high quality evidence that this is going on. So again, we have radar evidence for UFOs, and we have radar evidence for weather modification, which is undeniable in my view. We talked earlier on about Project Storm Fury and using planes to seed clouds to affect hurricanes. We've looked in the last few minutes at energy effects being used to modify the weather. Obviously how this is done we're not sure, but it could be some derivative of orgone energy. In other words, imagine a spaceborne version of Wilhelm Reich's Cloudbuster. And here we have some discussion of actually the picture that I'm showing you and the commentary doesn't quite match up, because we can clearly see here that Richard Hoagland is talking about Wilma, but this is Hurricane Ophelia, but he's describing a similar sort of effect. It's just that when I did the video clips for this I couldn't get the Wilma one to work, but you can clearly see this same sort of effect as he describes.
Richard says he has seen some startling things happening. Richard, what have you found?
Well, as you know, because I sent you the image a few minutes ago, we've got evidence that someone is trying to kill Wilma. There is apparently the same kind of technology which we talked about last night in terms of the Ophelia loops a few weeks ago. We're seeing this extending from Honduras, which is several hundred miles to the west of where Wilma is now located, into the eye of the storm as a kind of a tuning fork of geometric red thunderstorms, a double line tuning fork shaped of very heavy downpours. Someone is apparently triggering rainfall at right angles to the storm circulation in an effort to both kill the winds, decrease the wind velocity, and to basically sap the energy of the storm by turning the evaporated water into rainfall and releasing the latent heat, which would go up into the atmosphere and would therefore not be available to fuel the storm.
I got to tell you, for me looking at this, it looks like, now you see the heavy rain, the dark red. It looks like it's like, I don't know, it's going straight. It's strange. It's like somebody shooting something at it.
That's right. This is a beam of some kind of wave energy which has interference patterns, so you get condensation, refraction, condensation. So think of it as kind of a rope connecting the center of the storm with Honduras there, and you've got waves going up and down causing condensation in a regular geometric pattern. This is not nature. This is not seen in natural storms. This is someone trying to kill this storm before it becomes another monster in the Gulf. Now, it's going to be fascinating to watch and see whether they're successful. As I said to you in my note a few minutes ago, we've only seen this now in the last couple of storms. We saw it in Ophelia. We saw it in Rita just before she made the turn. And now we're seeing it in Wilma, meaning that someone is taking, I believe, an off-the-shelf technology that may have existed for, decades before, and applying it to trying to reduce the severity of these storms, and we're going to see now whether they know what they're doing.
I find it interesting that we're talking about Nikola Tesla on tonight's program.
I thought that was incredible. I did not know you had your guest on, because this is exactly the kind of technology that Tesla was talking about. This appears to be a black ops version, a clandestine development over the last several decades that's been pulled out of mothballs or pulled from some other project and is being pressed into service to prevent Wilma from, as I said last night, Wilma from
Flintstones.
The Flintstones back to the Stone Age. If we get one more major hurricane, Cat 5, in the Gulf coming up and hitting the oil refineries, or God help us, New Orleans, it's goodbye coast.
Well, what's interesting is, Richard, that unlike Scott Stevens, meteorologist, who believes that the weather's being manipulated for attacks on us, you're saying that some people are desperately trying to stop this one.
Well, I think there are two camps. I think Scott is right that somebody is doing something to enhance and direct storms for destructive purposes. I disagree with him in terms of who the bad guys are, because I don't think we know enough to know who the bad guys are. But I've also sent him this data, and he agrees with me that this is data of some kind of suppression being obviously applied by the B team, the opposite team, hopefully our team.
The good team.
Let's say the good guys. I think the technology of hurricane suppression or alteration or enhancement is state-of-the-art, and you're seeing it on your website.
And very quickly, what's the bill that they are passing for weather manipulation, just so everybody realizes that even Congress is considering this?
Well, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who is the very prominent Republican from Texas, who you see on all the news shows and commenting on the president's selection of the new Supreme Court nominee, etc., she is the gal who several months ago in March introduced in the Senate Bill 517 for transfer of technology to a weather modification board in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Do you think Kay may know something?
And we'll hear more about this law shortly. Now, another physicist who has an unconventional view of things like weather and weather modification is a chap called James McCanney. And you can see his website at jmccannyscience.com. There's lots of audio and things on there. And he really thinks that weather modification is quite, regularly used now. And he says that he actually developed a system to help with steering hurricanes, as you'll hear. And he says that you can steer hurricanes around by dragging the lip, just as it would be possible to make a person go where you want to put, if you put a ring through their nose or lip and attached a cord to yank it. He says Space Command at NASA has the ability to steer hurricanes and flat out states that this just happened with Katrina. He feels it is highly likely that additional contrived events will occur for the purpose of triggering martial law in the USA. So here we're getting the ties in things like 9/11 And the previous slide ties us into directed energy, which is what we think was used to destroy the World Trade Center towers. So who knows, maybe they can use the same technology for destruction of structures on the ground as for modifying the weather, and it's just more tightly focused. Who knows? It's just a guess on my part.
Katrina formed out of a tropical depression as it came up through the Bahamas. It formed very quickly to become the hurricane that passed across Florida. The standard path for that storm should have been north along the west coast or along the east coast, much as the tropical storm Ophelia is doing now, passing up to the right and then up into the Carolinas. That would be the normal path for that storm, just as Floyd did. Now, all of a sudden, Katrina makes a sharp left turn, runs over Miami, and then makes another left turn. All of the prediction paths of the computers showed it going north after it passed through Miami. It did nothing of the sort. It made another major left turn, headed out south as a very disorganized thunderstorm, and within 30 minutes developed into a Category 3 hurricane. And it moved out westerly across the Gulf of Mexico till it hit about midway, and then it made another sharp right turn and started heading north-northwest up towards the Texas border. Actually is where it first started to move to. If you drew a line from its path, it would have hit somewhere in East Texas. So it's moving northwards, and then it's kind of bending towards New Orleans. But even 100 miles offshore, Katrina was headed west, mind you, west of New Orleans. As it moved closer, it made a perfect curve, like a perfect strike pitcher's curveball, directly north towards New Orleans. And of course, at that point, we all thought New Orleans was toast. At that point, when Katrina made landfall, it made a very sharp right-hand turn, almost 90 degrees, and headed east towards Biloxi, Mississippi. And the reason for that turn was because it went over two of the prime oil refineries that had been missed by Ivan and the other four storms that had been guided into that area over the past year. 5 major tropical storms, including hurricanes, moving into that Mobile, Alabama area. But the people guiding the storm knew that the big refineries, the 2 big ones that needed to be hit, lay just east and south of New Orleans. And so anyway, this storm, Katrina, went dead center over that location. But now understand that as Katrina was a Category 4 pushing Category 5 hurricane 100 miles offshore over New Orleans, even the manipulation of the storm couldn't keep it driving at that rate. It lost power. It was only a Category 2 storm as it actually hit those refineries. And as it hit the left part of the eye, just grazed Lake Pontchartrain, which lies north of New Orleans. If you look at my weather book, this has a lot more detail that the severe storms are driven from the ionosphere, something that just about every NASA conference now is coming to the same conclusion. Gee, isn't that interesting? So if you understand what causes the weather, then weather manipulation is the secondary effect, or the understanding of that. So first of all, HAARP was a technique to send radiation, radio wave radiation in large volumes into certain areas and concentrate it on a certain area. But it really was not that effective. They could do a little bit of weather manipulation. They could somewhat move cloud systems around, but it was not very effective. Back in the mid-90s, I came up with a technique that I took to the Air Force. And now I regret that terribly. It's the same reason why I will not take any technology to these people that would be used to get through the Van Allen belts, because these people use it for devious mechanisms to harm the public. What I did in the mid-90s, I took this to the Air Force and NOAA, and I said, I will give you this for free. It's a technology which will allow us to manipulate storms and drag them away from shorelines that would affect people, and we can diminish the energy in storms using these techniques. Well, what they've done is taken those same techniques, built large laser satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, and these are what are dragging the storms around and pumping up the energy in these storms. What they basically do is they shine a laser, and these can be in many different frequencies, and this is what I measured directly last January when I went out into the Pacific, because I knew they were doing this. I knew they were playing with these storms out in the Pacific off the west coast of the United States, and I got up to an altitude of about 40-some thousand feet, about 45,000 feet, and was able to view and capture the satellite manipulation of a storm system as they took it from Oregon and dragged it down towards California. So this was the first direct measurement confirmation that they were manipulating these storms with satellites and the laser beams coming down from satellites.
So they have James McCanney's testimony that weather modification is real. It is often said that when they disclose something like weather control or weather modification as being in research stages, it's already been in use for military purposes for years. So this seems to be the stage that we're at now. One of the important bills is H.R. 2977. This is Dennis Kucinich's bill, and it was proposing a ban on space-based weapons. And it was put before Congress on the 2nd of October 2001. And the bill says, this is Mr. Kucinich on the right-hand side. On page 5 of this bill, it defines some of the types of weapons which should be included in the ban. And such terms include exotic weapon systems such as electronic, psychotronic, or information weapons, chemtrails, which is the only time I've seen this mentioned in legislation, high-altitude, ultra-low-frequency weapon systems, plasma, electromagnetic, sonic or ultrasonic weapons, laser weapon systems, strategic theatre, tactical or extraterrestrial weapons, and chemical, biological, environmental, climate or tectonic weapons. This was all in the first draft of this bill. All these incredible statements. Now, if you ask me, I think it's confirmation that all these things are in use and have been in use for some time. So, H.R. 2977, that's the one to watch for. And then more recently we've had this bill, Congress Bill S517. This is the one that Richard Hoagland referred to. And it proposes, in this, it was put forward in 2005, introduced March the 3rd, 2005. This gives the name of Kay Hutchison rather than Kay Bailey. Perhaps one is her maiden name and one is her married name. Section 2 says, it is the purpose of this Act to develop and to implement a comprehensive, coordinated national weather modification policy and a national cooperative federal and state program of weather modification research and development. So it's in the legislation. And again, we've had an earlier bill some years ago, UN Resolution 31/72, environmental modification, which is another name for weather modification, of course. Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. Adopted by Resolution 31/72 of the United Nations General Assembly on 10th of December 1976, the Convention was opened for signature at Geneva on 18th of May 1977. Article 1 states, each party to this convention undertakes not to engage in military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques having widespread, long-lasting or severe effects as the means of destruction, damage or injury to any other state party. Each state party to this convention undertakes not to assist, encourage or induce any state, group of states or international organisation to engage in activities contrary to the provisions of paragraph 1 of this article. So again, we see this sort of thing being set up as a treaty, and typically what these treaties actually mean is somebody's always actually done or is doing what the treaty is said to be stopping doing. Like, so, you know, they've had space-based weapons for years. They just don't tell you they have. And this is typical. I mean, this is sort of typical of the statement you sort of get from Defense Secretary William Cohen. And he talks of weather control, and this was in 1997, so obviously we're looking at 10 years ago now, for the time that I do this. Other terrorists are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism, whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. So there are plenty of ingenious minds out there at work finding ways in which they can wreak terror upon other nations. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our counter-terrorism efforts. This is an extraordinary statement. Now, for me, knowing that 9/11 was an example of false flag terrorism, this statement is another similar example describing a false threat, i.e. the real terrorists are the global control groups who've got this technology and are using it on a daily basis, not rogue nations. We don't have to worry about Al-Qaeda getting hold of this technology, because the people that Cohen is speaking for, not about, have this technology. And they're using it against us in subtle ways, and then they're lying to us and pretending that it doesn't exist. That is the reality, as I understand it. That's the only thing that explains all the evidence. How can Al-Qaeda, people who supposedly live in caves and, and this sort of thing, and are religious fundamentalists, how can they develop space-borne weapon systems to have these effects on the climate and the weather? It's just, Cohen's statement is just doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny at all. So for somebody of his caliber to be making it, he must have another reason. So what does this all mean? I think, as I've already alluded to, weather modification has been in use for years, both in public and in secret projects. It seems that chemtrailing and advanced weather modification are black projects. So look at the black budget and where the money is being spent. Maybe as much as $1 trillion a year on black projects. Their existence is officially denied, despite things like Cohen's 1997 speech. If you try and ask anybody about this in a public capacity, they will deny it exists, even though we have the evidence presented in this presentation. And the key factor is we cannot take the issue of climate change or global warming at face value without embracing the evidence shown in this presentation as being part of the true picture. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs and all the details, but if you ignore chemtrailing, if you ignore those satellite pictures which show the circular rainfall patterns, you are not getting an accurate picture of global warming. That is the truth. Scientists and others who refuse to do this will end up with the wrong conclusions based as they would be on an incomplete picture of the facts, as recorded in photos, videos, radar, etc. My guess is that with the reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology, the beneficial weather modification technology, far more advanced than that developed by Reich, it's probably some derivative of that, has been stolen and used to the advantage of the global control group, essentially just as Jim McCanney said with his hurricane modification technology. Whoever is doing the chemtrailing doesn't seem to be concerned about the humongous amount of aircraft fuel being used in the process. This leads me to believe that the idea of peak oil is also a scam, because if these aircraft are up there on a daily basis for thousands of hours all over the world, then they're not worried about the amount of oil that they're burning. They don't have a supply problem. It is part of a wider program of deception to induce us into feeling even more so that the end of the world is nigh. Another part of this fake is the war on terror. That's a fake, including the 9/11 hoax. It's all part of the same program of deception. It fits the pattern of the global elite creating enormous problems and then offering us to sell us the solutions or enticing us to give up our basic rights in exchange for protection. We should be very wary of this and try not to live in fear. The aerosol crimes which you've seen evidence for here need to be exposed and people responsible held accountable for their actions, ultimately. The weather modification technology must be disclosed, exposed, and we must ensure it is used properly, because at the moment it isn't being used properly. It's being used for harm. To do this, many more people must become aware of the information presented here, because if they're not aware of this information, they will go on thinking, oh, this is odd weather. It must be that God is coming to kill us all, or something like that. Or it's the apocalypse. No, it isn't the apocalypse. I don't believe that. I believe that people are making it look like we're heading toward the apocalypse, with 9/11 being part of it and weather modification being another part of it. And so therefore we are now in pivotal times where exposure of the evidence here and all the other evidence pertaining to the global scams such as the ET cover-up, the cancer cover-up, the energy cover-up, the Apollo hoax, the 9/11 hoax and resulting war crimes and genocide is paramount to our survival as a civilized people. That's what's at stake here. You will have to fight for the truth if you want it in your own way. Now, just as a closing thought, when I posted the Borrowash grid picture on the web, I received some emails from all around the world. Now, one of my favourites was this. At first, I got really mad and felt like taking aim at the jets when I first heard about what they could be spraying us with, but now I don't pay any attention to them, and I just affirm to myself, nothing can harm me, not even the government, or even the global elite.